Good evening. Hi, Monique. How are you?
Hi, Mary Margaret. How are you? Good evening, everyone.
So welcome to this evening's Community Conversations. I'm Reverend Mary Margaret Earl, and I'm the Executive Director of the UU Urban Ministry.
And good evening again, everyone. I'm Monique Veale. I am the Director of Special Projects, and I have the honor of working with Mary Margaret Earl at the Urban Ministry.
And the Urban Ministry, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is a very old nonprofit that's located in John Elliott Square in Roxbury. And we have 50 member congregations around Greater Boston that participate in our work. The three core programs of the Urban Ministry are we do services and programs to survivors of domestic violence, including a shelter for survivors and their families. We have a workforce readiness program for survivors. The second thing that we do is we have after-school programming for high school students where we provide tutoring and college preparation. And we also cultivate an appreciation for history, and especially Roxbury and Boston's rich history. And finally, we provide arts and humanities as part of our community engagement work. This is the kind of event that in a normal time would be happening in our meeting house. But because we can't be together quite yet, we've been having these community conversations through the past 10 months or so. And Monique, would you tell folks more about our community conversations?
Sure. Our community conversations, as Mary Margaret has said, are happening and have been happening over the last few months. And the purpose of these conversations is to highlight the history, the art, and the experiences of our Black and Indigenous people of color. These conversations provide an opportunity to raise awareness around some of the issues that tend to plague the residents of color in Boston neighborhoods. These conversations also provide information on how to support the organizations that are doing this work in order to help the folks of color. So we thank you for joining this evening, and we look forward to you joining us in May as we have a conversation about Black people in the land, urban farming, and rural farming. So thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Monique. And so this evening, we're going to begin, as we do with most of our community conversations, and we're very happy to share what we call a commitment minute, which is sharing some words from our sponsoring congregation. This month's congregation sponsoring us is First Parish in Medfield, and they wanted to share a few words about their commitment to racial justice and the work of the Urban Ministry. So here's this month's Commitment Minute.
Good evening, everyone. We are so pleased that you're here for tonight's UU Urban Ministries community conversation. We at First Parish Unitarian Universalist in Medfield are delighted to be the sponsor of tonight's conversation.
We look forward to hearing from Dr. Atyia Martin. We are grateful for this opportunity to understand more about how to foster well-being in communities of color and how we can collectively take better care of one another.
At First Parish Medfield, we are committed to learning and acting to dismantle systemic racism. To that end, we have created educational opportunities within our congregation by reading and discussing books by authors including Ibram X. Kendi, Ijoma Ulua, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Isabel Wilkerson, engaging in a multi-week workshop on decentering whiteness, and educating our congregation about the 8th UU principle.
Our Wayside Pulpit in Medfield displays an anti-racist letter to the community, regularly presents important anti-racist quotes, and hosts a Black Lives Matter sign. First Parish in Medfield is a longtime supporter of the work of the UU Urban Ministry, volunteering with Fair Foods and contributing financially.
We value the work the UU Urban Ministry has been doing to build bridges across race and place, so that together we can work to dismantle racism and white supremacy. Together we envision a world where all people live with freedom and dignity and have equitable access to resources, an opportunity to shape the present and the future.
We are so pleased that you are all with us this evening to engage in this critically important conversation. Welcome.
Thank you so much, First Parish in Medfield, for those wonderful words and for your support. Now, we're going to share with you another part of the work of the Urban Ministry. For the past 10 months, as we've been doing community conversations, we've also been highlighting the richness of the businesses that are in Roxbury, and in particular, many of them are Nubian Square, which is right down the street from the Urban Ministry. So this evening, we're very proud to share some information about one of our neighboring restaurants, Suya Joint. And we'd like to share with you the commercial that our social justice fellow, Bithia Israel, filmed highlighting the wonderful food at Suya Joint.
Hi, my name is Tamika, and welcome to Suya Joint. Our location here in Boston is 185 Dudley Street in Roxbury, across the street from Hibernian Hall. You can also catch our food truck around the city on our social media. Our online experience is pretty easy. You can actually go on suyajointrestaurant.com, and you have a choice between Boston and Providence. One of our favorite meals here is a combo, which is jollof rice, choice of meat, and plantains, sweet plantains. And that actually was featured on Phantom Gourmet just recently. He tried it with the fufu, and the fufu is a finger food. Normally we eat crackers. This is our cracker. the fufu is like the cracker. Well, you dip it in a soup. When you mention a soup for Nigeria, it actually can be of a thicker consistency, more like a stew. Our mission statement is literally to share Africa with the world. We have at least 3 different countries, or 4 even sometimes, coming together. So we try to involve ourselves in the community in any way, shape, or form that we can. If they come to approach us with an idea, we are totally there for them. Most recently, we were partnering with World Central Kitchen. And at World Central Kitchen, we provided the meals, and they actually paid for the meals. So the voters and volunteers at the West Roxbury site was able to actually have a hot meal as they went to voting or left from the voting. We do offer gift certificates. You can buy that here or online at suyajointrestaurant.com. We are actually open from Tuesday through Saturday, and our hours have changed for brunch on Sunday mornings from 11 to 2, and then for evening service from 5 till 9 p.m.
Move right into introducing, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Atyia Martin. So Dr. Atyia Martin is the CEO and founder of All Aces, Inc., an alternative to traditional diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firms. Dr. Martin and her team partner with businesses, nonprofits, and government on organizational, professional, and personal development that advances racial equity and builds resilience. Her personal mission is to unleash the invisible power that every person and organization has to intentionally act to disrupt oppression. Dr. Martin has over 20 years of experience applying the principles of racial equity and social justice during her career in resilience, emergency management, and public health and intelligence. Dr. Martin is published in scholarly journals and is the author of We Are the Question and the Answer: Break the Collective Habit of Racism and Build Resilience for Racial Equity in Ourselves and Our Organizations. Additionally, she is a distinguished senior fellow at Northeastern University's Global Resilience Institute. She has held previous professional roles that include Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boston, which is where I had the pleasure of first meeting her. And she has been the Director of the Office of Public Health Preparedness at the Boston Public Health Commission and adjunct faculty in the Master of Homeland Security, as well as public policy programs at Northeastern University.
Dr. Martin has also held positions at the Boston Police Department's Boston Regional Intelligence Center, City of Boston's Mayor's Office of Emergency Management, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the U.S. Air Force as active duty assigned to the National Security Agency, and the Initiative for a Competitive Inner City. Dr. Martin is a certified emergency manager with an Associate of Arts in Serbian Croatian from the Defense Language Institute. She has a Bachelor of Science from Excelsior College, a Master of Homeland Security Leadership from the University of Connecticut, and a Doctorate of Law and Policy from Northeastern University. Dr. Martin and her husband were born and raised in Boston, where they currently live. They have 5 beautiful children, and 2 of them are still at home. So thank you, Dr. Martin.
You know they're
for being with
beautiful.
Did she add that?
Of course, they are. All children are.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction and the additional, the ad-libbing. I appreciate you, and it is such a pleasure to be here with both of you and Mary Margaret. I feel like we go way back, and we've had some really amazing conversations. In the past, we've broken bread together. We have had caffeine together.
Right.
I have toured the UU Church in Roxbury and all of your vision for the programming. So I just feel really, I feel reconnected to you again, and I'm very excited about this conversation. So thank you for having me. Thank you for your patience with my chaos, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation.
Well, I'm looking forward to too, and it is so nice to reconnect with you. I remember all the amazing work that you did in convening people across Boston to come and talk about racism and to talk about resilience. And so it's really a joy to be able to bring that perspective to our audience and to friends of the Urban Ministry. So I'm going to just start right out of the gate with just an upfront question for you, Dr. Martin. What is racism and how does it work? And that's a big question, and I'm just going to throw that right at you.
Yeah, thank you for starting with the easy stuff. So I think there's 2 things. One, racism is a system. And so I'll talk about that piece. And the second thing is that it sits on top of our human condition, right? Our human realities of how we're wired as human beings, how we are socialized as human beings, and then how we therefore think, or our psychology around how we see ourselves, other people, and therefore our behavior. So when it comes to racism as a system, there's actually a great quote that from a book that I read on systems that I pulled for this conversation, because in a book about, from an engineering perspective, they're talking about systems. And they spent a whole section on talking about how do you know that something is actually a system?
It's interesting.
And when I read it, I was like, oh my goodness, that is exactly how racism works. And I had never actually looked at it through that lens until I actually read that particular article or that particular book, and then found that section in the book. So it begins with this understanding that when we talk about systems, that ultimately we're talking about multiple parts of something, and each part by itself has its own consequences. It has its own function. So when we think about a system like racism, we're thinking about the ideas that are the foundation of it, right? If we think about it in layers. So there's the ideas about who people of color are supposed to be, or who BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are supposed to be, and who white people are supposed to be. Even though the stereotypes are about people of color, like it by default communicates who white people are therefore supposed to be as well. And that's really coded in what's normal, what is American, what is, when we think of kind of, they call it the default character in our brain about what a person is when we're like, when we're reading a book, right? Those are the kind of those are the ideas that are associated kind of with what it means to be a white person, not who a white person is, but how what we should expect from white people, and the stereotypes for people of color about what we should expect from people of color. And in the instance of racism, those ideas really reinforce a restricted identity for all of us, right? You have to be a certain way, and when you step outside of those boxes as a white person or as a person of color, then something's wrong with you. You're flawed, and we should be concerned. Or you're exceptional if you're a person of color, right? And you step outside of certain boxes, you're the exception. You're not like those other people of color, right? So those ideas that we have about who deserves to be in certain spaces and things like that. Then there's how we then internalize those ideas. We get exposed to them our whole lives, all day long, every day, every movie, the news, music, everything that we get exposed to, people we love in our lives, people we trust in our lives, all are expose us constantly to these ideas. Our brain cannot tell the difference between something we're watching that's fiction and some in real life. And so it's cataloging all of that information as data points that is helping us to navigate the world. So whether we believe it or not, we've internalized it because we've been exposed to it so much. It's a well-worn path in our brain, whether we believe it or not. And then it influences how we then see ourselves, right? And how I therefore see you, which influences how I interact with you, like that interpersonal part of racism. And then there's this institutional piece, which all of that together, the idea, right? The internalization, the interactions, and it adds yet another piece on top of that, which is policies, programs, and programs and kind of practices that our organization has in our culture. So racism is stealthy in the sense that as part of that system, all of us are part of the system that we keep about. And it shows up in these very powerful ways. So for me, when I think about racism, you can simplify it and say, prejudice plus power, right? And when you talk about racism,
prejudice plus power,
racial prejudice plus power. That's how most people talk about it.
That's like summarizing what you said, right? Yeah.
Summarizing everything.
Yep.
And it's way more complicated than that as a system, right? And that's
Yeah.
the second thing about a system, is that it each part can operate on its own, but when you pull it all together, it's a whole nother animal in and of itself. It becomes something more and bigger. Then it's more than the sum of its parts, in other words. So I'm going to stop there and say that's.
Yeah.
So just thinking, sorry, Mary Margaret.
No, please go ahead. Yeah, please.
Dr. Martin, in listening to you talk about institutionalized racism, and you often will hear people talk about dismantling racism. What does that look like? And you started to touch on it a little bit when you spoke about policies. If you had to kind of lay out a plan for dismantling, removing it, what would those 3 to 5 steps look like for organizations to begin that process? And I know it's much more complicated than 5 steps, but at least I'm wondering, what would that look like for an agency to begin that process?
Get your act together and start giving such long answers. I got you.
No, that's not it. No. We're sitting in the living room. This is fine. Your answer's long. It's fine.
I'm teasing. So, it's really fascinating because the question actually is connected to how we got to the question, which is how complicated racism is, right? All of the layers. So for organization, the first piece is to acknowledge that people make all the decisions in organizations. So organizations are a collective of people. I want to explicitly state that, because the policies that we then develop as people in organizations, whether we're government, private sector, nonprofit, philanthropic, whatever, that the policies that we create are where those opportunities live. The culture we create in our organization is where those opportunities live. And then the structure and process of how we operate as an organization is another layer of equity opportunity for us. And in each of those buckets, the best way to approach it is, number one, to acknowledge the humanity part of it, which is related to that human condition piece, right? We oftentimes want to talk about what everyone else is not doing or doing, right? It's harder to flip the mirror around to ourselves and see what we're doing or not doing. So as an organization, the first piece is looking at our own culture and looking at our own way. And when I say culture, I want to be specific, because some people are like, oh, culture's squishy. Culture's not squishy. Culture is when I walk into your organization, whether I'm an employee, a customer, a resident, because you're government, that you're a constituent you're supposed to be serving, whatever, that everything that I see, hear, and feel when I navigate your space and whatever you offer is your culture. It's the product of your culture, which are your day-to-day habits as an organization. So first step is to understand where we are in our organizations, right? From a representative perspective, from this culture piece, and from structure and process. What are the barriers that are in people's ways of navigating internally, so your employees, as well as externally, the people that we're supposed to be serving? The opportunity I think we have is, how do we look at who do we really want to be, though, right? So we have to make a decision about who we want to be collectively in an organization. And then the third piece is, now that we've decided, what are the things that we need to do to close the difference between where we are, where we want to be, right? So I boiled that down into 3 pieces. When it comes to policy, the shortcut answer is targeted universalism. If you've never heard of that, that's John A. Powell has been a huge promoter of that as an approach, which in essence is, one size fits all doesn't work. We know this intellectually. In practice, like many things, it's a lot harder. So what that means is, we can't create policies that are only that have no consideration for the different realities that people have for whatever the purpose that policy is. So we can have a universal target for a policy, but that we can't stop there, right? We have to then say, okay, but what is the current state of affairs between where we want to go with this policy and where we are across everyone? And we can't stop there. We have to then say, well, by, if we're talking about racism, by different races, how are different people experiencing this policy? What is the data that we have about where the different places people are? So if we want to use a practical example, John A. Paul oftentimes will use education as an example. So I'm going to go with his example. We want 100% of all students to graduate high school, right? That's the universal goal. Right now, only 70% are graduating high school. So we know that what our challenge is for everyone. And we know that for Latinx students, it's 60. For Black or African-American students or the diaspora of Black people, that it's 64%, so on and so forth. So you go through and you look at what are the differences, because now I know that I have different gaps between each of the groups. And I have to do an analysis to figure out what are the barriers in the way of students, whether they're structural, system, process, culture. What are the barriers in the way of students being able to succeed in achieving the goal of we need to graduate 100% of our students? And I have to develop a strategy for each group differently in order to achieve this universal goal. So we're targeting our strategies to achieve this universal goal. And it's so important because it's the best practice. Like when you think about anything, no company produces a product that is for a generic person. There are products that are for men, for women. There are products for urban, rural. There are products for older adults, children. So every product or service has a target audience. And it's designed to meet the differences of all the different target audiences that they choose to serve with that product or service. It's the same principle with policies. And Monique, I failed in my mission to use less words.
But I want to.
You were fine. Thank you.
I wonder, Dr. Martin, can you, Monique's question really strikes me because I do think that as an organization, we're thinking about what does it look for us to be able to contribute to dismantling racism and white supremacy culture. We have many member congregations that are really focused on this issue. And so that's, so those are a good goal, but what does that mean is really a compelling question. And one of the sub questions that I had come up when you were talking was, you talked about culture not being squishy. It's what you see, it's what you hear, it's what you experience when you come into a place. Can you give me an example of a practice or something you might see or practice that is more welcoming to BIPOC individuals and less? What are some things that organizations that lean into that white culture do that winds up feeling not welcoming?
Thank you for that question. So part of it is something that's not directly related to racism. And then the other part is the part that's not directly related to racism is in many organizations, we've developed a culture based on of how we do things, based on quote unquote best practices. In the 80s, we did this big pivot towards shareholder value. Everything was about how do we do things in a way that had to fit this very particular mold that was based on shareholder value. And what's really bizarre and interesting is that that same pattern filtered into most organizations in this country, right? And so some of those things are you dehumanize everything, right? Everything's about boxes and charts and arrows and numbers and metrics, and we're you remove the humanity out of things and you focus on the stuff. In absence of us rehumanizing our organizations, no one's going to feel welcome there, right? And so what does that mean? That means that when people show up, that we greet them. We actually speak to people. We offer them help when they show up. From a visual design perspective, when we're talking about physical space, that there are pictures that around that kind of signal to people that we recognize that this is a diverse world that we live in, and we represent that diversity here, through even what decorum we have around that people get exposed to. And so part of it is there's something about what's welcoming for human beings. And then there's a whole nother piece about what's welcoming in terms of acknowledging that we live in a diverse world. And so when I come in, I not only do I see the decorum being representative of that diversity of the real world, I see it in the people I bump into when I'm navigating the organization. And so those are some of the high level ways. From a more practical way, it's also about when we engage with people, the shortest way to say this, when we engage with people, how do we let curiosity lead us, that's not rooted in stereotypes we've been taught about people. In other words, how do we make sure that we're not assuming we already know a bunch of stuff about people, and really our curiosity is about confirming stereotype, as opposed to, I really know nothing about you as a person, and I'm so curious about who you are, and I'm going to allow myself to be surprised by whatever I encounter with you as a human being, because I'm curious. I'm really curious. I'm not just curious about validating what I think I already know about you.
Thank you. Thank you for those examples.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, Mary Margaret, about, as we are moving forward with a new mission, and listening to Dr. Martin talk about who do we want to be, and what does that look like at this time? I do want to know, what are your thoughts about helping us to get a very clear message across about what our culture looks like, and how do we make sure, as organizations, as churches that are affiliated with the urban ministry, and many other businesses and organizations that do this similar work around social justice, how can we make sure that when we open our doors each and every time, that it is a space that feels welcoming? It is a culture that is woven through every program, every conversation, every language that we use, every report that we write, that says we are embracing, we are open, we are willing to learn, while talking to people and saying, here's what you need to know when you come through our doors at the same time.
So that's really interesting, because and what's as I processed what you were saying, it made me think of change management. And change management, I mean, that's basically what we're talking about doing when we're talking about doing racial equity, social justice work in our organizations. And is that there's this whole process we have to go through, and it's heavy lifting, and it takes time. And there's some short-term wins we can have. And so when we think about, well, how do we do that? I would say number one is the strategic direction of the organization. Is it clear from how we talk about who we want to be, whatever that is? Is it clear to other people our connection to, or our commitment to, racial equity and social justice? Like, is that clear, even right off the top? The other piece is values. Values get undersold so much, and they are so critical. So we have, when we're working with organizations, there's a strategic direction, values, right? The values that we have written down on paper. And then there's under norms and standards, kind of like some of the cultural pieces, there's the habits, the values that we actually practice in real life. And they're not all oftentimes the same, because we don't bring those values that we write down into how we do things. So for example, one of our values as an organization is collective care. Collective care as a value. And so for us, we've defined collective care as our ability to connect with each other as human beings in the organization, to support each other, to care about each other, and to help create the space as individuals and as the organization for folks to be able to take care of themselves. Because self-care is not enough. It's not enough to say, you need to go take care of yourself. We as people need to help create the space for that to happen, and the organization needs to create the space for that to happen. And so how do you do that? And how do you turn that value into a practice every day and apply it to the work we do? Before we start a meeting, we don't just jump into business. We actually check in with each other personally. It's not just a, hey, how you doing? Oh, I'm good. You know, it's no, how are you doing for real, for real? Like what's going on? I remember last week you were saying that, you know, you were worried about this. How'd that turn out for you? Like, did your stuff ever show up? You know, whatever the challenges folks have communicated before, we're checking in on each other. Why? Because that's part of the value. We've said, like, one of the things we want to do is make sure we're leading with caring about each other. Another way we practice it is we have collective care co-working time. So every Friday, we have 2.5 hours together as a team where we're catching up with each other at the events of the week. We're doing our work, but we're doing it together in virtual space. So we're all kind of doing our stuff. We can ask each other questions, kind of like water cooler opportunities, like those.
Interesting.
But it allows us to stay connected as human beings to each other and to really care about each other and to build relationships with each other. So that's like a practical throughput. And the value, now I'm using value in a different way. So the value of collective care is people are happier. Like people, even when times are really stressful, like right now we're in a really, really stressful time as an organization. And people are navigating through it without falling apart because they know that they're supported. They know if they need to take a step back, that will be supported. They know that if there's a problem with a client, they're not going to get thrown under the bus, right? Those are the things that help people hold on to their dignity and humanity in the workplace that oftentimes we don't understand the value of.
I love that. I love that example. Dr. Martin, I once worked at an organization that had a meal site to serve folks who were hungry and in need. And one of the core values was hospitality. And one of the concrete ways it showed up is that people were seated and served one plate at a time. So volunteers would not grab a bunch of plates and throw them down, not cafeteria style. It was serving one plate at a time, putting the silverware, say, have a nice meal. And to me, that was a very clear example of how you put into actual action that value. So I think that's really interesting to think about. And what does that look like if we're working at dismantling racism? How does that look? What does that look like when we're trying to advance racial equity? So these are great considerations for people to take back to their organizations and for us to think about in ours about what does that look like in a clear practice.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
And I'll say this one more piece because I think oftentimes organizations don't realize the business case. The business case for racial equity and social justice and overall, there's some around diversity, equity, inclusion, but there's a ton on the business case. It's been done to death, to be quite frank. There's so much data and stats and that basically say, hey, if you have diverse teams, and so it's not just having diversity, but if you have diverse teams and you have a culture that is welcoming, where people feel like they're cared about. Gallup did a poll. They do every few years, this international poll. They ask people about, the things that they need from their organizations, the things that keep them in an organization consistently across the world. My supervisor cares about me. I have friends at work. I have a voice and I have autonomy in my ability to do my job. I'm part of decision making and in my organization. I feel like my voice is heard.
Mhm.
And this whole piece around feeling like I'm not left out of things. So there's this has been replicated over and over again on different issues, and there's numbers tied to it. So if ever you need to have to make the business case because you're not in charge in your organization, there's a ton out there of two key resources. I said Gallup. Gallup has amazing stuff that they've done. The second one is the Society of Human Resource Managers, Society of Human Resource Managers, SHRM, SHRM. And so they have a ton on the business case for this. So I just wanted to share that for folks who are trying to figure out, like, what does this mean for me and my organization? Ton of stuff out there. The business case is strong.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So again, during our conversations over the last couple of weeks, we talked a little bit about who our audience members are, our community members, our stakeholders, all of those people who care about the work that we're doing at the Urban Ministry. And wondering what your thoughts are about how can people get involved and support the work of your organization and many other organizations who are really committed to doing things better, doing the work, really unpacking and dismantling racism. What are your thoughts about how some of the people who support this work can get involved, and what do you suggest the first step be for it?
I would say shameless plug. We have a online learning community for folks who care about these issues and are trying to figure out what it means to them personally, professionally, and what it means in their organization. And that's intentionallyact.com. So I welcome folks there. We have hundreds of folks on there from around the world, and who are really just struggling through these things like the rest of us, but are at a higher level in their knowledge and development. So it doesn't feel like you're having to have the same conversations over and over again, and you're constantly teaching people. But we're it's more of the problem solving piece. I would say the other important piece is related to what an organization needs to do, which is decide who you want to be and where you are and what you're going to do to close that gap. Same thing for us as individuals. And I know this is hard because, we're all doing amazing work, especially if you're in the nonprofit sector. We tend to equate racial equity and social justice work with the mission of our organization, and they're not the same thing. And so I say that to say that it's important that we're constantly working on ourselves in this. As a Black woman who identifies as African American, whose family's been here for generations, I have continued to be on my own journey. I do this work every single day with my team, with organizations around the world. This is what I do every day, all day long. And I'm constantly managing myself. I'm constantly challenging myself every day. Am I being present in this moment? Let me not have an immediate response to that thing, because I know that my immediate response is denial and defensiveness. So let me take a few moments to breathe and not allow that to be driving how I respond in this moment. How do I make sure that I understand the social context of how we even got, what is this thing called race and racism and oppression and all that stuff? How do I make sure that I understand the historical context? I'm still learning about historical moments that explain why today looks the way it does. And I imagine that I will continue to be surprised by some moments that happen that explain certain patterns that we see today. I spend a lot of time on emotional intelligence. Do I understand why I'm feeling what I'm feeling in any given moment? And the difference between that and reality, just because I feel attacked doesn't mean that I have been attacked, right? So, and how does that translate into my relationships with people? Am I paying attention to how I'm impacting other people with whatever it is I'm doing or saying? How am I managing my relationships so that it's not just purely transactional? How do I make sure that I'm not running away from conflict? Because if I run away from conflict, I'm running away from relationships. If I'm running away from conflict, I'm running away from opportunities for me to be better and do better and to show up as my better self and not throw people away because I'm running away from conflict. How do I make sure that I'm communicating well, that I'm listening, not just to the words people are saying, but for the meaning of what they're saying, the emotion behind it? How do I make sure that I'm communicating with myself meaningfully? That inner narrative, that inner voice that we never quite get a chance to, we never learn about. But there's this whole inner universe inside of us, right? And so like, how do you manage that communication? And then the last thing is critical thinking, right? How do we build our critical thinking skills so that we don't fall into the potholes? There's a ton of them, just the way we're wired and have been socialized, and the way we think oftentimes will lead us to places that are not logical, and we're not rational beings. We at our best, at best, we can say that we are boundedly rational. Under the right circumstances, we can be rational. In which means that we need certain knowledge, skills, and tools to do that. And critical thinking is a key one in order to make sure that we are not doing status quo, the usual, the easy thing, the things that basically reinforce oppression without us meaning to do that. And the last thing I'll say in this point is, if there's no level, if we don't feel like when we're engaging with people, if I don't feel like I'm working in the conversation, if I don't feel like I'm working in the exchange, then I'm not really my best self in that moment, right? And that means that I'm probably doing something or not doing something that might be causing harm to the other person on the other side of me. And so that is the heavy work that it takes. And it's made me a better mom. It's made me a better wife. It's made me a better leader, a better follower, a better listener. I've just been better as a person, and I continue to strive to improve as I try to navigate, because the racial equity, social justice work that we need sits on top of our human development. And if we're not developing ourselves as human beings, then it's really hard to do racial equity, social justice work, because they're intricately related.
I love when I listen to you, Dr. Martin, talking about how this work that can sound political, like social justice, but is also, you're framing it in this way that's about stepping into the fullness of our humanity and becoming whole human beings, and all the work that it takes to do that. And that's just really powerful and moving to me. So thank you for that. And it really, one of the questions that I have is kind of the two sides of the same coin, but if you can speak to what is our personal responsibility to do the work of dismantling racism, to do that work in all its multiple levels. And in the introduction to you, I talked about your belief in unleashing our power in the doing of that, which is sort of the challenge, the responsibility, and the gift of this work. And I wondered if you could speak about that to individuals, the responsibility and the gift of doing the work.
Yes. And I hinted at it earlier, and you just created space for me to be more explicit. So for us to do this work well, there's a level of humility involved. There's a level of vulnerability involved. in flipping the mirror around from everybody else, right? Because that's kind of how we do, that's how in a lot of people's minds what racial equity and social justice work is, right? I have to call out this person because they said this, and I have to do this. Well, you're not doing this and they're not doing that. And the heaviest lift is to flip the mirror around and be looking at ourselves. What is it that I am doing or not doing? And the way that responsibility looks and feels is, how have these ideas about who I'm supposed to be, I'll use myself as an example, how I'm supposed to be as a Black woman infected me, and how have they become barriers to my personal growth and development? Right, they're in the way of me reaching my full potential. So I have to peel layers back in order to understand that, which means I have to get to know myself a bit more, because again, that whole inner universe, there's a lot going on in here that unless we actually turn that mirror around and spend some time exploring, it's unexplored. Right, it's foreign to us, and we find ourselves not understanding why we're doing certain things or why we're reacting certain ways. And so for me, my personal responsibility in this is to better understand that about me, right? That I am not a perfect human being. I make mistakes. And when I have the humility to acknowledge that that I have contributed to the system of oppression, I've contributed to racism, even as a Black woman, not in a reverse racism kind of way, but in the sense that the ideas that I was infected with impacted how I saw myself and what my possibilities were, but they also impacted the way I saw other people who look like me and other people of color. And whether or not I respected their expertise, or I could defer to them, or, oh wait, here comes a white person, they're gonna know more than this person, right? It's not a conscious thought, but when I started paying attention, I saw that there were some patterns that I was recreating. How I have conversations with people, what I'm willing to advocate for in meetings where decisions are being made about that will impact real people's lives, right? Like, I have a personal responsibility. I have to figure out when I'm in these different spaces, am I going to show up as my best self? Am I going to be making sure that I'm advocating for myself and that I know what that means and looks like? Am I going to advocate for other folks who are going to be impacted? Am I going to speak up when we're heading in a direction that is clearly going to be harmful? And so for each of us, that we have a circle of influence that we have, starting with ourselves. That's the most important one, because we're part of the system. That's how we started this conversation. We're part of the system. And so in dismantling the system, we kind of have to dismantle a lot of the strongly held beliefs and ideas that we've had about how the world works and why we think we have to do certain things or don't do certain things. And when it comes to racism, it gets so extra complicated because it's those ideas on top of these entrenched experiences of dehumanization that has a very emotional connection, right? So no matter how enlightened I am in my development, I still have to manage myself. I still am harmed by racism. I'm not always my best self, and I have to know when I'm not my best self, so I don't put myself in situations where I could cause harm to other people. I have to work really hard not to fight oppression with oppression, which is really easy to do because that's like the norm, is to be oppressive to other people, to dominate other people. Like, I have to walk in the room and take control of the room. I have to walk into the room and make sure I have all the answers and all of these things that we've been taught that you're supposed to do. And that's what good leaders do. And if you want power, if you want to be successful, like, these are the things you do. All of those things reinforce oppression. So reimagining who I really want to be, and all the work is going to take me to get there, is really the personal responsibility. And when I'm in spaces that I use my voice, that I understand what I'm willing to risk, and then I'm using my voice in ways where I'm not being too safe, and I'm actually, willing to risk some things in those moments to advocate for who I say that I am and want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And that's heavy,
Mm-hmm.
and it's beautiful and amazing all at the same
Mm-hmm.
time. It's like being a parent, right? It's like all the superlatives, the good, the bad, the
Heavy,
ugly.
beautiful, and amazing.
See, I told you all of them were beautiful and amazing. All of those children.
So, Monique, is it time for us to give Dr. Martin a moment to breathe? And we're going to share our commercial again. Again, to our friends who are gathered, each community conversation, we highlight a Black-owned business that's in our neighborhood, and we encourage you to purchase gift cards, to shop as things open up more to support these businesses. And tonight we're showing a commercial that we created about Suya Joint, which is right down in Nubian Square. So here's a break, and we'll come back with Q&A in just a moment.
Hi, my name is Tamika, and welcome to Suya Joint. Our location here in Boston is 185 Dudley Street in Roxbury, across the street from Hibernian Hall. You can also catch our food truck around the city on our social media. Our online experience is pretty easy. You can actually go on suyajointrestaurant.com, and you have a choice between Boston and Providence. One of our favorite meals here is a combo, which is jollof rice, choice of meat, and plantains, sweet plantains. And that actually was featured on Phantom Gourmet just recently. He tried it with the fufu, and a fufu is a finger food. Normally we eat crackers. This is our cracker. The fufu is like the cracker. When you dip it in a soup, when you mention a soup for Nigeria, it actually can be of a thicker consistency, more like a stew. Our mission statement is literally to share Africa with the world. We have at least 3 different countries, or 4 even sometimes, coming together. So we try to involve ourselves in the community in any way, shape, or form that we can. If they come to approach us with an idea, we are totally there for them. Most recently, we were partnering with World Central Kitchen. And at World Central Kitchen, we provided the meals, and they actually paid for the meals. So the voters and volunteers at the West Roxbury site was able to actually have a hot meal as they went to voting or left from the voting. We do offer gift certificates. You can buy that here or online at suyajointrestaurant.com. We are actually open from Tuesday through Saturday, and our hours have changed for brunch on Sunday mornings from 11 to 2, and then for evening service from 5 till 9 p.m.
All right, so we're going to come back with our guest, Dr. Atyia Martin, and we're going to invite our participants to ask any questions that they have of Dr. Martin. So I do want to remind people that you can ask your questions in the Q&A. You can also put them in the chat function. And if you would like to be heard and actually say your question aloud, you can raise your hand and we can enable you to actually say your question. We won't see your video, but you'll be able to speak your question aloud. Just note that we are recording this, so you want to be mindful of that if you do choose to go ahead and raise your hand to be heard verbally. And we will take questions for the next 15 or so minutes. And one of the first things that popped up earlier was that for the intro slides was that it was great music, and please share the musical artist names. And I don't have that off the top of my head, but if we are able to find that out, we will certainly share that. So first I want to just go back and ask another question which is in the chat box, which is, Dr. Martin, what are some of the most common structural challenges that you see organizations struggling to address in dismantling systemic racism? What are some of the most common structural challenges that you see organizations struggling to address in dismantling systemic racism?
So one is leadership. I have found that, and not just that I have found, the research shows, and in my experience, I have witnessed it, which is that an organization can only go as far as the development of its leadership. So if leadership is stuck, the organization gets stuck. The other piece is how we diversify our organization. So when we think about racial equity and social justice, we oftentimes, people in organizations will say, oh, we need to diversify our organization. So it becomes a numbers game. And it's like, well, how many people can we recruit? How many people can we bring into the organization without consideration for what are you bringing people into? And if people of color and you know, for that matter, any marginalized identity does not want to be in your organization, then it's likely that the people who are in your organization don't want to be there either, because there's larger issues going on, and so to name that explicitly, it's trying to diversify without creating a space that is welcoming for people, that is addressing its root causes, the root causes of the negative experiences that people of color have in organizations. And one of the patterns that I oftentimes see is when one of the common patterns for how organizations operate, where they don't mean to operate this way, is someone brings up an issue that's related to racism, because we asked them to. We said, hey, we want to know like how we can be better and do better. And folks say, well, particularly if you're a person of color, folks say, well, you know, this is an issue here. I noticed that leadership is predominantly white, and you know what's going on where there's a ceiling that's preventing people of color and other folks to be able to get up into leadership. And oftentimes, instead of the problem that I brought up being the problem, I become the problem. Right. So now I'm labeled as the problem instead of us addressing the actual issues that our employees are bringing up. And then the last one I'll mention is a lot of folks want to talk about racism. They want to have sessions, town halls. They want to have conversations in organizations. And dialogue is an important part of doing this work, but it is not the work. Dialoguing with no clear direction, dialoguing with no connection to this is going to inform how we're going to be better as an organization. Dialogue for the purposes of, even if we're saying, you know, we want to build relationships, right? That's even a specific goal, but oftentimes that's not what organizations are doing. And then the last piece are just policies. I said that was the last one, but the last one is really policies, and being willing to take a look at them and analyze them by race to see what are the differential outcomes that people are experiencing dealing with our policies, whether it's about promotions, whether it's about how people are expected to show up in the workplace, whether it's visibly speaking or what we consider professional, all those types of things. But that ultimately there are these policy patterns that we oftentimes say, well, it's fair because there's one policy for everyone. And there is no policy or system or approach that is unbiased. That it's not, there's no such thing as being kind of neutral. Everything we do has an impact. And when we're not intentional, we tend to have inequitable impacts. So not owning our responsibility. Can you speak of the role of restorative justice practices in organizing changing cultures of white supremacy? So the best way to say this is restorative justice is an approach that is really helpful in the sense that it's trying to move us away from the well-worn kind of counterproductive paths that we've usually been on. And I would say it's one of many approaches that are available to us that help to shift some of those dynamics when it comes to how do we make sure not just that people are heard, but that we're addressing the issues that people are bringing. And that when people are harmed, that there is a clear process to for people to get some kind of wholeness again, for there to be some acknowledgement, not just of that if it's an interpersonal issue in an organization, for example, not just that the interpersonal issue is addressed, but is there something that we did as an organization that created the space for that thing to play out the way it did?
Yeah.
So there's lots of layers to that.
Yeah.
That's a very good point.
How do we think about the difference between anti-racism and DEI?
So Dr. Martin, I was going to say maybe you can answer two questions at once, possibly.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. Which
Absolutely.
is, what is the difference? And then there's a specific questions about all ACEs being an alternative to traditional DEI and DI firms. What are some of the flaws with traditional DEI consulting? So maybe combining both of those questions together.
Thank you for that, Monique.
You're welcome.
So some of the flaws are related to this idea that I'll say it this way with the story because it's easier that way. So I was actually in a workshop that a well-known organization hosted, and it's supposed to be about creating an inclusive workplace. And it was all centered around these DEI principles, their research, we're gonna, put these into practice in organizations. And many of the approaches were very much about how to get people of color and other marginalized identities or underestimated groups to fit better into the context of an organization. And so many of the approaches were really about how do I get you to learn how to navigate this hot messness instead of addressing the hot messness. Right? Like, let's help people figure out how to navigate all of these problems of the organization. So we're going to have some leadership programs for people of color, which implies that the problem is that we don't have leadership skills, as opposed to the organization not recognizing the leadership that we bring. A lot of work around, how do we make people feel comfortable in spaces? Well, you don't want to do that because that's going to make people uncomfortable. It's very interesting. And I don't think I had full insight into the DEI world because I was more living in the kind of like racial equity, social justice space. And once I became more involved in that space, it really was a lot of whiteness baked into some of the approaches. So kind of peeling those layers back from the DEI world. And so instead of coming into an organization and saying, hey, let me tell you some strategies about how to diversify your organization, and let me tell you about policies you need to create that will allow you to not get in trouble. Let me tell you about how your organization can train folks so that they have language to talk about these things. Let me. And a lot of the things are not actually addressing the root causes of why we're seeing these experiences in organizations and why we're struggling so much with these in organizations. And the last thing I'll say is the difference between anti-racism and DEI is a lot of times DEI is used as a way to not talk about racism and not talk about racial equity and social justice. So what happens is we can talk, well, we'd rather talk about women and like the gender gap or gender inequities in pay. We'd rather talk about LGBTQI plus issues. We'd rather talk about lots of other things than talking about this racism stuff. And so a lot of times it becomes one of many things that people want to talk about. And oftentimes other things edge it out because we haven't really reconciled with the pain and suffering of how racism is harming not just BIPOC, but yes, clearly BIPOC, and we know that the data and the impacts and the health and wealth and all those things, and how it's harmful to white people in terms of having to align yourself with ideals and standards that you didn't create that for yourself, right? And what that does to the how we that lack of fulfillment that oftentimes we feel. It's the soul is missing, right, from DEI, like the soul of doing the work and connecting it back to the scary stuff that we don't really want to talk about, the scary stuff that is connected back to structure, systems, process, culture. And when we try to make it too neat, and when we try to fit it into fit people and approaches to complicated things into neat little boxes, we're never going to be effective. And this piece around some of the last thing I'll say, I said that already, with the kind of traditional DEI flaws or challenges, really is that if there's still this idea that you can just train your way out of it. Like if you have enough trainings, all of this will magically just go away. I've worked with organizations that have had so many different organizations come in and do so many different trainings that it's overwhelming, like when we get the reports back. And still they're like, and we've not made the kind of progress that we want, because training by itself is not enough. And I know we do trainings, and I'm not trying to put myself out of business, but I'm saying that by itself is not enough. So I'll stop there because there are way more questions, and I want to be respectful to the questions coming in.
So one of the questions that I'll just read for folks a lot is Dr. Martin, can you speak about some of the success stories that you've seen? What's an example? You don't need to name names, but of an organization that you've seen that really adapted its culture and changed an existing culture of white supremacy?
I'm actually, there's several clients that I've seen go through this process, and I'll have to be honest, they were, one of them was the most surprising. We were like, it's messed up here. And we were like, oh my God, this is a heavy lift. Like this is, between leadership and the dynamics between leadership, the challenges they were having with how people interacted with each other. There were these very unhealthy ways people engage with each other. There was a lot of policing of language and each other in these very not developmental ways. The policies themselves, like how people got promoted, was unclear. And so every time there's not a lack of intentionality about how we promote people, you get kind of predominantly white leadership. And so this organization, like from all accounts, was not doing well. And fast forward just a little more than a year later, not just because of work that we did with them, because I don't want to take ownership of people's commitment to the work. What I will say is that we supported them in facilitating the process to be able to figure out who they wanted to be, because what was happening was not it. So kind of getting clearer about understanding where they were as an organization, getting clearer about, well, who do we really want to be though? Like now that we know that we're struggling with these things, like, but where do we want to go? And the organization did a lot of heavy lifting. They listened. Leadership stopped being defensive about everything and really processed what people were saying to them. And I've said this to leaders of cities and of large organizations, that when people are bringing you the challenges that they're experiencing in an organization and there's a pattern, right? That's the answer to the test. Even if you don't like how they say it, you don't like who it came from, you don't like whatever. But when people bring these things to you, it's a blessing in disguise. Because now you know, oh, well, clearly this is a thing that if I work on it, it will help people have a better experience here. It will remove some barriers that are in the way, so much so that people were willing to come to me and express it to me at potential varying levels of risk to themselves.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. You have shared a lot of information. You've given us a lot to think about. And as we are starting to wrap up, I want to give you the opportunity to leave us with some closing words as you think about the various journeys that we are all on as individuals and as organizations. Because there's a lot of work to be done. And most of it starts within us as individuals before we can begin to see how important this work is in other places. So I will leave it there and ask that you give us some parting words.
And while Dr. Martin is speaking, we're actually going to put contact information for her organization in our chat function, so that if people are interested in learning more about the work of All ACEs, for your congregation, for your organizations, you'll find the information there in the chat button, so you can cut and paste that. And I'm going to give Dr. Martin the last words.
Thank you. I'm not gonna lie, I feel a little pressure. Last words are always hard. So two points that I'll hit on, and I'll use quotes as my guide because I love quotes. So one is actually from James Baldwin, and this is for for all of us, and especially for people of color who are watching. And that is, you have to decide who you are and force the world to deal with you, not with its idea of you. And that summarizes way more eloquently and simply than all the words that I used earlier. And I share that one because we live in a world that is constantly trying to tell us who we are and how we're supposed to be in the world. It's constantly telling us that we're not good enough if we make a mistake. It's constantly telling us that the image of success is looks a certain way, feels a certain way, and if you don't look and feel that way, then you're not successful. And the reason why I love this quote so much is it challenges us, all of us, even though I sent that shout out to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, that it applies to all of us. How are we going to own our invisible power to create the kind of change that we want to see? The other quote I'll share with you is related and is about the importance of speaking truth. So I'm going from James Baldwin to Friedrich Nietzsche. So all over the place. And it's always speak your truth. Silence is way worse. Silence or truths unspoken become poisonous. And And so silence is poisonous. So when we think about all the different spaces that we're in, and if we own our responsibilities of what it means to advance racial equity, social justice, and anything in our lives for that matter, anything that we commit ourselves to requires us to be clear about what our truth is, which is not always obvious. That we do the work to figure that out, that we hold ourselves accountable to it, and that when we're holding people accountable to racial equity and social justice, that the biggest person we're holding accountable is ourselves. And that much of how change happens in the world is modeled and not always finger wagging and pointing at people about what they needed to do. People need to know what it looks and feels like to do this work well. And many of you are committed to this, and in your commitment that you're willing to share with others your journey, your struggles, and some of the things that have been helpful to you on your way, because it's hard to imagine what this work is if you only are part of mainstream media or exposed to mainstream media and social media and all those things that most people are only exposed to. And so to have a little empathy with those around us, meet them where they are, model what it looks like to do this, and remember that we were those people at one point, that none of us was born with all of this knowledge about these things, and to not fight oppression with oppression.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. It was an honor and a joy to be with you this evening.
Agreed.
Thank you so much for bringing all your knowledge and wisdom and insight to this forum. And we were so happy that you could be with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the work that you continue to do every day. Thank you for your commitment to our communities and people of color. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monique. I appreciate you. Thank you, Mary Margaret. Thank you to all of you. Sending lots of love, hope, and intentional action to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Be well. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.